It looked like somebody was bent over and had their head in the window of the deer blind. It either heard me or smelt me, and he pulled his head out of the tent and stood straight up, and that shocked me. They don't make people that big.
The way it moved, almost as if it was gliding across the beach. I've never seen anything move like that in my life. They were screaming at each other in gibberish. It sounded like a language, and they were chuntering away back and forwards, back and forwards, back and forwards. I know what a bear looks like, and there is no way on this planet that what I saw were bears.
911, what are you reporting?
Jesus Christ, you better...
Sir?
Gia!
Hello?
Get somebody out here.
What's going on now, sir?
That son of a bitch is about 6'9", I don't know.
Do you see him now, sir?
Yes, I'm looking right at him.
Uh-oh.
Hi, I'm James Wafer from Liverpool, UK, and I'm listening to real-life diabolical accounts on Sasquatch Chronicles.
Happy holidays, everyone. Thanks so much for being here tonight. Got a great show planned for you. Tonight we're going to be chatting with Darren. And over 41 years ago, he was in the New Jersey Pine Barren area. His grandparents owned property up there. And Darren, along with his brothers and some of their friends, had a run-in with one of these creatures. Darren didn't know what it was at the time, but I'll let him go into it. If you've had an encounter and you'd like to be on the show, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. If you get a chance, check out sasquatchchronicles.com. You can become a member and get additional shows. Let's jump into it tonight. I want to welcome Darren to the show. Darren, thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I know that this encounter happened to you over 41 years ago. If you would, just kind of start from the very beginning, kind of tell us what you were doing, and then walk us into what happened.
So yes, this was in approximately 1980, maybe 1981. My brothers and I, we lived with our grandparents on and off for various reasons. And at this time, we happened to be staying with them. And they lived very much on the edge of the southern New Jersey Pine Barrens. I don't know if I'm sure some people are familiar with the Jersey Pine Barrens. It's a very, if you look at it on the map, it goes from the northern tip of New Jersey pretty much straight down the center of New Jersey, all the way towards the southern, almost towards the southern tip of New Jersey. It is both beautiful and sometimes scary. It can be very, very dense, wooded areas that open up into open fields, but it's huge. I used to know some statistics about the Pine Barrens as far as like how much of the state it covers. It's a lot more than people think. It's massive. When we were younger in the area that we lived at, there wasn't a lot to do. But the one thing we did like to do is hike. And that's my brothers and my friends from, we'll call it the block that we lived on. It really isn't a block, but just a country street. So we did a lot of that. It was normally every weekend we were either out on our tree forts that were also in kind of the edge of the Pine Barrens, or we would take long hikes that would span the entire day for the most part. And we wouldn't be getting home until it was almost dark. There were times when we would do this, we would bring food with us, and we didn't really have to bring anything to drink because I think I might have mentioned to you before is that in this area of southern New Jersey, there are springs everywhere. And as kids, we knew this. We knew where they were. And so when you got thirsty, you knew that within, at least in the area that we had explored to that point, as far as we had been able to make it without, because we would go out and try and see how far we could go before we'd have to turn back to be home before it was late and we would get in trouble. And so we didn't really worry about that much because we knew we could stop at one of these springs. And we took pretty much the same kind of path when we would take these hikes pretty consistently. And part of the reason for that was exactly what I was just mentioning, the springs. Because we knew where certain springs were, and we knew we would be thirsty by the time we would get there. We would stop, take a rest, drink. One of the things that's interesting is that over time, and I have no idea who did this or when it was done. It could have been within years of us that taking at the age that we were taking these hikes. It could have been there for 40 years. I have no idea. But some of these springs would have these metal pipes driven down into them. So here in the middle of the Pine Barrens, where there is nothing, and you'd come across this metal pipe sticking out of the ground with pure crystal, very cold water just pouring out of the top of it. It's actually pretty smart that someone would do it. I assume hunters did that over the years, so you didn't have to be drinking out of a kind of a stream. But anyhow, that's what we would do on the weekends, and we would usually get up pretty early to do this because we wanted to maximize. Even at that age, to us this was fun to get away from the grown-ups and just us buddies, us friends, hiking through the woods, and kids at that age, between 11, 12, 13, just horsing around. We would leave between like 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning. Our parents, our grandparents, they knew where we were going. I know it was myself, my brother, who was, I'm the oldest of 3 boys. My youngest brother was too young at this time, so he was not with us. And so it was me, and the middle brother, and at least 3, maybe 4 of our friends. When we took these hikes, I would say there was anywhere between 5 to 8 of us. It just depended on who was around, who could go, and at that time, on that particular day, I want to say, because I remember the names of the 3 people that were with us. But and that's what leads me to believe at this particular time there was 5 of us, me and my brother and the other 3. We start on our hike. We head out there. We're about, I want to say maybe a mile or so into our hike, and we knew that we were coming up. It might have actually been a little longer than that. Now that I think about it, maybe a mile and a half, 2 miles possibly, because I'm trying to remember this particular spring. We knew we were coming up on the very first spring, and it's the one that I was explaining earlier that had the metal pipe sticking out of it. Very soon, and this particular spring happened to be very close to what we were termed or called a fire cut. I have no idea who did this. I think I mentioned before, I'm assuming that the Forestry Service did this. I have no idea when they did it because they did look old, but they're basically trenches gouged out through the forest. And because there's so many springs in that area, they would fill up with spring water. And they were about 2.5 feet wide, maybe a foot to 2 feet deep. And I guess the idea with a fire cut is basically to try and prevent forest fires from spreading. I don't know if they actually work, but that's what we were told they were. So we knew we were coming up to this particular area because there was the fire cut and there was a spring. Now, I will say this, that most on the beginning of the hike, most of what we were walking on was a trail, was an well-established trail through the forest. However, at some point, the trail kind of like narrows, and then we would veer off the trail to head towards where this spring was. It was not on an actual trail. I really don't know how far away I was when I first noticed that something looked different. Given that we used to take these hikes so routinely, you get used to seeing landmarks or not seeing landmarks. If there's an open area, you typically, if something all of a sudden pops up in there, you're going to kind of go, what is that? And that's kind of what went through my mind. I'm looking, I know where this spring is, the general direction, and something looks different about that area. As we get closer, it became evident that something was different because the area on the opposite side of the fire cut from where the spring was had been basically shaped into a hut. And when I say shaped, it wasn't that it wasn't like someone broke down limbs and then, engineered a freestanding hut or something like that. Everything that had been there was almost like weaved into this. The limbs of the trees, the bushes, the whole, it was very dense back there. It had just been molded into this kind of dome shape. I always say, like, if you took a sphere, cut it in half, now you have a half a sphere, cut that in half again. So now you got this kind of half dome looking structure. That's what this was. Now, it wasn't perfectly shaped like a dome, but it sure was close. And you were seeing this as we're coming up on this area, and I'm thinking to myself, wow, who the heck did this? In my head, I'm thinking, how could this be done like this? And it was actually pretty impressive, but strange at the same time. As we're getting closer and we're able to see more details, I smell something that just smells rotten. I mean, it smells horrible. And sitting in this hut, this dome-shaped hut, was a deer. There was a dead deer lying in the hut. Now, again, we're not right up on this yet. We're on the other side of the fire cut. You'd have to get to the other side to where this dome-shaped structure was. You would have to, leap a good leap over this thing. And trust me, there were times where I'm sure we did this and we fell into it and had soaking wet feet, but you would have to jump over it. There was no going around the fire cut. It was that long. So we were coming right up towards the edge of the fire cut that on the side that we were on and looking at this deer. And it was, if I'm facing towards it, its head was to the left of me and its rear was to the right of me. From about, I'd say, a good foot or so from the tail up the spine, all of the meat and skin was gone, completely gone. The rest of the deer looked pretty much intact. It was, if there was any decay, I don't know if this was decay or not, and you'll see what I mean by this in a little bit. When I remember I mentioned I smelled something, it was a putrid kind of smell. I'm thinking it's this deer, but the deer did not look like it was rotting. Now, I'm sure there was some decomposition going on because I have no idea how long it was there. It couldn't have been a long time because even though the back end of it had been stripped of all its flesh, all of its meat, and when I say stripped, I mean the bone looked like it had been almost bleached. There was very little, if any, flesh or sinew or anything on any of this bone, of this deer skeleton, just the back, its hips, and what remained of the legs. But the front end part was still intact. The head of the deer was, even though it was towards my left, I couldn't see it because it was tucked kind of under itself. Like the neck had been twisted and the deer's nose and face was facing like towards the ground. So initially, I didn't really get a glimpse of the face, but we're just sitting there standing looking at this thing. And even though we're pretty young, being around hunting and people who hunted, we were no strangers to seeing deer, being strung up and butchered and things like that. That didn't bother us. And it was a pretty, not routine, but it was a normal thing in our lives. So I wasn't really concerned about what I was seeing. What I was concerned about was how it looked. You know what I mean? It didn't look normal.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a normal kill at all. I want to ask you now, are you guys across the fire cut at this point? Are you near the shelter or kind of where are you at this point?
We're not inside the structure. We're still on the other side of the fire cut. So in between us and the deer is that 2.5 foot wide stream that is the fire cut, and the dome shaped structure is nearly right to the edge of that side of the fire cut.
I got you.
Yeah, we were close. We were about 2.5 feet away from, maybe 3 feet away from the deer, but we were not in it. The dome structure itself, like, I'm pretty tall. I'm 6'3", 6'3.5". Now at that time I wasn't this tall, but I was still pretty tall even at 13. This dome shaped structure was big enough and tall enough for me at that time. And I don't really, I'm going to guess and say maybe 5 feet or so. I could have stood in it and I wouldn't have hit the top. It was pretty big. And it was, I would say, maybe 4 or 5 feet deep. And just laying right inside of it, right up close to where the fire cut was, is this deer. We were perplexed. We were just kind of trying to rationalize it, thinking, if a hunter did this, why would he have left it here? Number one, why take all this time to weave this crazy dome structure out of all the plants and the trees, like right here? It really didn't make a lot of sense. And I couldn't figure for the life of me how the bone could have been left like that. Why it looked the way it did. The actual part of the deer that still had flesh on it, it was dried for sure, but not to the point where I could still see glistening of the blood around, especially around like the spine area. You could still see it wasn't running, but there was a glisten. So that had not been there awfully long. I don't know how long, but not too long. I guess long enough for whatever took the meat off the back to do what it had to do. So we're sitting there just kind of horsing around and trying to figure out what we're seeing here. What, of course we're looking around now because we're thinking, I guess my initial thought process was, of course, this had to be somebody else, that did this, but just couldn't get my head wrapped around this scene I was looking at. Again, nothing looked normal, or as I would expect it to be. And I remember grabbing a stick. We never crossed that fire cut. I'll say this. We never actually went to the other side and went into this structure. None of us did. I was trying to find a stick that was both long enough and strong enough that it wouldn't break or bend, because I wanted to try and get a look at the deer's face. Because, like I said, it was turned and facing towards the dirt. So I got this stick and I'm like reaching across the fire cut, and I was able to pop the deer's face around, not looking straight at us, but just to, looking left. And I could see that it all looked intact. Its tongue was sticking out and its eyes were slightly hazy. You see a lot of times, like when animals die, that they get this kind of foggy look in their eyes over time, the longer they've been sitting there. There was for sure, but not much. And again, in my head, even though I was only 13, being around hunting and all that stuff, I'm thinking to myself, this definitely has not been here too long. At this point, I would say we were there about a minute or two. As I'm looking at this deer's face, we all hear a shuffling sound behind the structure, but it was and it was loud, but it was going towards the right. So it was kind of funny when I think about it now, but almost in unison, the entire group of us just shifted to the right of the dome, and that's when we saw what we saw. I was instantaneously stunned. Um, I remember I actually got tunnel vision. Like, I don't know if I was going to pass out or what, but I literally got tunnel vision because when we shifted to the right and after, because we had just heard all this noise, about 30 to 40 feet behind to the right and behind that dome is now standing the scariest looking thing I've ever at that point and have ever seen in my life. And it was massive. It was tall. And when I say massive, I think I used a word when we talked before, gargantuan, because I don't know what else to say. I mean, it was every part of this thing's body, its shape was huge. And it had hair over its entire body, but it was matted like dreadlocks. It most of the when not, and I wouldn't say, like, when I say dreadlocks, and not the actual definitive what most people think of dreadlocks, where they're like they look like ropes of hair. It's the only way I could say it because it was more matted. But the picture in my head is like dreadlocks. It was matted, dreadlocky type hair, like a reddish brown color, and it was everywhere. And it was hanging all down its face. We never actually got to see its actual face because that hair was everywhere. To me, I don't even know how it could see. I mean, I'm sure it saw us, but there was so much hair and it was so matted. I have no idea what it saw through it or how it was seeing through that. And it was just standing there. And again, even at 53 years old, when I think about this, it still shocks me. Like, in my head, I thought within that first few seconds that we were dead. I thought that was where I was going to die, right there. We were all so scared we couldn't move. There was no sound. Nobody, not a one of us made a peep, and neither did this thing either. Not initially. Within about 15 to 30 seconds of us standing there, so we're on the other side of that fire cut. It's about 30 feet to 40 feet directly in front of us. It was so big, even at that distance, it was so big, I had to tilt my head up to look at the top of this thing. I'm going to say it was easily 8 feet tall. Easily. I'm sure I'm selling it short. I'm sure I am. It had, even though it had hair all over it, like, I could tell that it was muscular because of the form, and it made no sense, the proportions of this thing, no sense at all. And because I couldn't see its face, that in a way, I initially thought maybe that was even scarier, but I'm kind of glad in a way that I didn't see his face because we were already scared. I'm not sure what was behind that hair, but I'm wondering. I wondered after the fact that maybe that was a good thing till I didn't actually get to see it because I don't know. I mean, you hear about people dropping dead of heart attacks. I don't know if that would happen at 13, but I was close to that in my, rhetorically, I guess you could say. And within about 15 or I'm saying 15 or 30 seconds, because I don't remember exactly how long before this thing actually made a noise, but it felt like forever. It felt like forever that we were standing there looking at this thing, and it was just looking. I mean, it was just straight, not moving. In fact, when I first saw it, I'm thinking to myself, "Am I seeing what I'm seeing?" It wasn't moving. I knew it could move because we heard the noise. That's why we shifted off to the right. And all of a sudden, it literally let out I say a scream because it wasn't like the closest thing I could say to the way this thing sounded was if you've ever been to a zoo and you hear if you're inside inside enclosure where they have the lions and the tigers and they roar, it was like that. Now, it wasn't a roar like a lion or a tiger, but the effect was similar. This thing let out a scream
it was a escalating sound. It started out as a low rumble and then just went up and up and up in tone. It almost, at some point, Russ, it almost sounded like there were multiple voices. I don't know why I'm saying that, but it's the only way I can get across how crazy this sound was. It was like hearing it in stereo or something like that, or not out of phase, but it's like there were multiple tones in it. So it was so loud and so scary. You could feel it through your whole body. Like my chest was vibrating, and so when you compound seeing that, being 13 years old, seeing this scary thing in front of you, and now it's making this sound. I think that's actually when I really thought we were dead, because like anything that could make a sound like this, it was the scariest thing ever. The scariest thing, Wes. I don't know what else to say other. And I was, I heard people now, again, being 53 now, and I've watched some of your shows, and I heard people talk about something called infrasound and all that stuff, and I know what that is. All I could say is that this thing, I felt this roar. I call it a roar. I felt this roar through my bones, into my bones. And then as it got at the very, like, I'll call it the top of the roar, it leaped. It's like it fell forwards and then leaped straight at us. And I actually never saw when it leaped, when it lunged, when it came down, like it was coming down, like it was going to go on all fours. But I never saw it go on all fours, because when it did that, the top of its roar, and it was coming down, it was obvious to me it was going to lunge towards us. So I grabbed my brother, who was standing right to the right of me, and as I grab him and I turn around, I see. I think we were probably a little late off the starting point. My friends were already in motion. They were just like I was. They were kind of stuck still as we were witnessing this thing. But when that thing screamed like it did, or roared like it did, and then came down as like taking off a start, like, you never watch runners when they're sitting there and they got their foot up against the brace and the guy pulls the trigger and they take off.
Yeah,
that's what this looked like. That's what this reminds me of. Like it came down like to a starting, like if it was on a starting point and going to go on a race, and it just there was no doubt it was lunging at us. And I wasn't waiting. So I turn around, grab him. My friends take off. We're heading back the way we came. We're all going in the same general direction, but everybody kind of scattered, but going in the same direction. I knew when we started running, and now I got a hold of my brother. He would be like at least 2 years. Well, he was 2 years younger than me. So he was younger, and I kept hold of him, and we ran straight. And in that area of the Pine Barrens, there's tons and tons of different types of trees, of course, but then there are these bushes. Now, we used to call them deer bushes. I don't know what kind of bushes they were. They were a broad-leafed plant bush, a broadleaf bush, and deer used to sleep under them. We would find deer under them all the time, or evidence of where deer had curled up underneath of them and slept. I'm guessing because of the broad leaves on them, it would keep the rain off them and stuff like that. But one of the things about these bushes that was common is that they would get overgrown with thorns. These thickets and thorns would grow into them. And now I knew that, but I was so scared, and I didn't want to deviate from the path I was taking. I just went right through them with my brother. I'm thinking, I don't give a darn about how cut up I get right now. I will deal with that later if I survive this event. And we went straight through them. Everybody did, because every one of us was cut up and scraped up when we got to the point where we actually stopped and were able to calm down and take a breath. Because, even though, you can do some amazing things when you're scared or under pressure, but there is a limit where you get to a point where there's just nothing left. I thought I was going to have a heart attack because I ran so far and so hard, dragging my brother, that when I came to a stop, and I'm sure others felt the same way, was breathing so heavily and my heart was pounding so hard. I thought I was going to die then. I just could not catch my breath. Obviously, I did, and we all did calm down. But I got to tell you, I mean, it was from the point of actually seeing this beast to the point where we got to there, where we were, because I never looked back, not once. When we took off running, I never once turned around to see if this thing was still following us, because I thought to myself, number one, if I turn around and look, I could trip and fall, and then it's over. I had no weapons on me. I didn't even have a knife on me, which was kind of weird because I usually, one of us or more than one of us would typically have at least a pocket knife with us, but I had nothing on me. Of course, neither did my brother. But I thought, if I turn around and look at this thing running after me, what good is it going to do? But maybe I'll fall, trip, and then we're both dead. So I never, ever looked back until we finally got to that point where we were, God knows how long we ran for, because it was quite a distance. We were back on trail for sure before we stopped, and not too far from the end of the street where our homes were.
That is a terrifying account for sure. I wanted to ask you, I'm sure, at 13, your 13-year-old self, you probably assumed it was chasing you. But looking back now over 40 years ago, do you think the creature was actually chasing you guys?
Personally, I do not. I don't think so. Because here's why I say this. Because even though I was running pretty damn fast, I was just holding my brother. I had a hold of him the whole time. I had a hold of his jacket, like his wrist and his jacket. And because I kept thinking, well, number one, I love my brother. I love both my brothers, but I love my brother. And I thought to myself, even at that time, like, I would have rather it got me than him, And also, I guess a little selfishly, I'm thinking to myself, if anything happens to my brother, my parents are going to kill me, But I say no because as big as this thing was, and the roar that came out of it, I have to believe that if it wanted to catch us, it could have.
So you guys make it home, and this is your grandparents' home. Do you sit down with either your grandmother or your grandfather and tell them what you guys ended up seeing?
Now, before we came home, where we had stopped and realized this thing had not followed us, and we got our breaths back, we had to take a good 5 minutes or so before we could even start walking. I mean, we were all spent. Every one of us were spent, dripping sweat, cut up, dirty, and I will say there were a few curse words going back and forth between us, because the discussion started at that point, but as we were going back, we talked about this. We talked about our experience. We didn't know what we saw. I do not know, and I do not recall if the word Bigfoot ever came up, because I just don't remember that coming up. I mean, we obviously knew this was some kind of animal, but it was something we had never seen before. We had never seen anything like this before. I couldn't even imagine something like this, And I do recall we talked about, number one, if we tell our parents or whatever, they probably aren't going to believe us, right? That's number one. Number two, if they did believe us, or maybe they didn't believe what we thought we saw, but they thought somebody maybe been doing something out there they shouldn't have been doing, like maybe poachers or something like that. We didn't want them going out there. I like, if I told my grandfather, I think he probably would have went out there and investigated that. I did not want that to happen, because I'm thinking, if he goes out there, what if it is still there? It's going to get him. We never told him. We kept this to ourselves. I have no idea if any of the other guys ever told anybody. I actually talked to my brother Clint. The first time I talked to somebody or talked about this event was about a year ago. And I talked to my brother Clint before that and talked to him. I asked him if he had ever told anybody. He had told his first wife about this. He told his current wife and maybe one or two of his other very close friends. But outside of that, it wasn't like he talked about this widely. I had not told anybody about this except to my wife. That was it. I had never told anybody else about this. My wife was the only exception.
Yeah, and I understand where you're coming from on it, Darren. I mean, how do you explain to, your grandfolks and what you just saw? The fear of having your grandfather go out there too as well. I get all of that. A lot of eyewitnesses, they'll talk about these shelters, hunters have run into them, and I don't think I've ever talked to an eyewitness that has seen them make them, but it's obvious that most of us suspect that they do it. Why they do it, there's different theories on that. I wanted to ask you, so you're looking at this shelter, you guys hear this noise, and then you guys all kind of look to the right, and there it is. It doesn't come out of the shelter, it actually comes around the shelter. What do you think it was doing?
I suspect, I've had time to think about this, I've had the time to talk about this in another venue, and I think what happened was we came up upon that structure, and again, an area we had been to many times before, and whatever this was behind that structure, a good 30 feet behind it, and maybe it was coming back, maybe it was going away from it, I don't know, but it was already there, because we didn't hear any noises leading up to getting there, checking out this deer and stuff like that. It was quiet as normal out there, other than, like the normal sounds you hear in the wilderness, the wind blowing the leaves, and, I don't remember if we heard any other animals going on, squirrels and stuff like that. But I think it was already there, and it was probably like, what the F is going on at my food? You know what I mean? Like it knew we were there. And was either watching us to see if we were just going to go away. And when we didn't go away, it had enough. And it just started when we heard the shuffling and we all stepped to the right, there was no movement going on at that time. In other words, it was standing out in the open amongst a bunch of trees, but there was not a single tree between us and it. There were trees all around us, but we had a clear line of sight right to it. To the left of it, where I presume it came from, it was thickets everywhere. From that structure leading all the way back towards where it was standing was a mess of thickets that a deer could probably navigate through it, but that sure as heck couldn't have without making noise. You know what I mean? So I think it really just was checking out to see if we were going to go away or what. And we didn't go away, and it finally just said, that's enough. Just like I think to myself, like an animal protecting its food. One thing that's interesting is, remember I mentioned that this hut was big and that I could probably stand in it. It was not big enough if this thing was standing, because this thing was towering over it. But when it lunged over and went down, yeah, it could have been inside that. It would have fit inside that hut. The hut was really wide. I would say it would be at least twice the width as it was deep and high. That's what I would say, because it gave it that dome shape. So it was a pretty big deer to begin with, and there was still room. Like the deer was sitting in the middle of the hut, right up on the water, and there was still room inside this thing. I don't remember seeing any. I for the life of me, I try and remember what the ground looked like. Where the deer, like, was there anything different about the ground? And nothing jumps out at me. So at least I'm only going to believe that as far as the ground it was normal, just except for this deer laying there. And I always wonder, like, did it make that shelter there? Number one, because it had the branches and everything were there to do it with. Plus, it was right on a stream. So here you got your food and you got your water. I'm assuming they drink. So, yeah, I think we ran up on it after it had been feeding, and then we disturbed it. Just like any animal that especially any predator. I'll call it a predator. Any predator animal with its prey, if you mess with it, they're going to get mad.
Yeah, the one thing I'm kind of curious about, Darren, I know you had grown up around hunters and you've been around guys cleaning deer, and it does stink. I mean, you're around blood and guts and that sort of thing. And so even by the age of 13, you knew that smell. When you were walking up on this hut and this deer, do you think that smell that you were smelling was the dead animal?
No. I don't. That's why I mentioned earlier that when I mentioned about the smell and that why I wanted to look at its eyes, that this will come into play later. I think it was this thing. I think the smell we were smelling was this thing, because when we got up on the deer, and we again on the other side of the fire cut, so we were still about 2.5 feet to maybe 3 feet away from being able to physically touch that deer. The smell we were smelling got stronger, but when I got up, there were no flies. There were no flies festering around this thing. Now, granted, it wasn't the middle of summer. I don't remember exactly what month it was or anything like that, but we were, let's say fall, okay? It hadn't snowed. It wasn't snowing. It was not cold enough where we would have to put jackets on, but you weren't going to be out in shorts for sure. So, it was, that might help preserve, the carcass of a dead animal a bit. But it was not, there were no maggots, there were no flies, which I remember thinking when I was trying to when I was looking at this thing and trying to get the deer's head around. Now, I didn't know what rigor mortis was then, as a 13-year-old, but I did know that if a dead animal lays for a while, that it gets stiff. That I knew. And I think there's a point in time where it becomes stiff, and then after a period of time after that, the active stiffness goes away. I could be wrong about that, but I believe that is the case. But this thing, the neck had just been twisted. It was not stiff. I was able to get it popped back around with that stick, so it was pliable, So I don't think the smell was the deer, because I don't think it was not at the point of decomposition where you would typically get that much of a smell. This smell, I think, was this thing, and it was gagging. It was like I remember I wanted to gag and maybe even get sick. It was compounded seeing it. When I say that this thing looked disgusting, I mean, it looked disgusting. In fact, I'll go as far as to say it might have been ill. It looked ill to me.
Yeah, what was it about the creature that makes you say, you thought it was ill?
The matted hair. The matted, again, we couldn't see, I could see skin under the hair, which was it was like a grayish black, like the charcoal, I would say, color. But the hair was, again, reddish brown, and it was matted everywhere. Every part of this thing's body was matted, raggedy, disgusting looking hair, as if it hadn't bathed in a million years. I mean, it was horrible. It was like it was just like a scene out of a horror movie, a monster movie. I mean, this was a monster to me.
Yeah, and what an amazing account to go through, especially being so young and seeing this thing. Was there anything else that really stands out to you regarding the creature? Its behavior is, I think their behavior in this situation is meant to terrify you. It's meant to scare you, that sort of thing. I think you and I agree, if it wanted to run you guys down, it would have.
Sure, yeah, there's no doubt in my mind. The shape of this animal is, I think the closest thing I know some people have said gorilla, we'll say it's gorilla like but with human features or something like that. To me, as I got older, and actually even at that time, I don't know if I told you this, but when I was that age and younger, I thought I wanted to be when I grew up, I wanted to either be a veterinarian. That was the big one. I really loved animals, and I thought, because the other thing was was a marine biologist. That was the other, and again, something to do with animals, But I loved the wilderness. I loved animals, and that was a thought in my head. And I remember asking for Christmas one time. I don't know if you remember this because I don't know how old you are. There was a company, I think it was Mutual of Omaha, had this thing where they would send you each month this like kit with all these cards in it. They were different animals and all about those animals, or it might even been National Geographic. I don't remember. And it came in a case, like a case with a hinge lid, and it was clear plastic on top. So it would have a thing in there about lions and tigers, every animal of the world, And I had those. What I saw. Now I'm just going on the shape. The closest thing I could say that it looked like, but it's way bigger than it should have been, would be an orangutan. Now, granted, I didn't see the face. So I'm not talking about the face of the orangutan. I'm talking about its look. It had long, gangly, but massive arms. And the legs were very, very similar. And it had, even though most of the head, I could see the head to me was a mound of hair. But the word mound is important because it looked like a mound. It didn't look like a normal head. It didn't look like it had a neck and like a regular head, like human being head, or even a gorilla head. If you look at a gorilla, to me, gorillas have a very well-defined head and shoulder, neck and shoulder. You know what I mean? It might be a little bit less definitive as far as the neck is concerned, but I think it's mainly because of the musculature around them. But to me, like orangutans they have a head, but this thing looked like the head was right on its shoulders. Now, I could be wrong in that underneath all that matted hair, there could have been a neck, a more defined neck, but not from what I could tell, that didn't exist. It was just this mound of hair.
Yeah, I understand what you mean. I want to ask you, Darren, after over 40 years of this happening to you, you're recalling it like it happened yesterday, which is what every eyewitness does, because it really does stay with you. But how did this kind of affect you over the years?
Well, I will say this, that even though there's probably some ancillary things about the event that have faded over time, the core of the experience is like it happened yesterday. I will never forget this until the day I die. It made me realize that there's things out there that just are not mainstream. You know what I mean? Again, I didn't have a big thought in my head that this was Bigfoot we ran into at the time. I mean, I had heard the word Bigfoot before, stuff like that, but that's not what I thought when I saw this. It wasn't until later in my life that I thought about that. But I think it might have been brought up, but this was just an animal of unknown origin to me at the time, and it was definitely an animal. It wasn't like esoteric or paranormal or anything like that. It was a real live animal standing in front of us, but I didn't think things could get that big. But the immediate thing it did to me, it took my love of the wilderness away for a very long time. Number one, I was never going into the woods again by myself, ever. And that was something I did routinely.
Yeah, I think most people go through that. I think people who've had encounters, you always hear of the hunter who he lives for hunting and he goes every year and it's tradition, and then they'll have an encounter and the hunter no longer hunts. And it's kind of a shame that fear grips us in that way. But it's definitely justified to have that fear grip you. I could see you not wanting to go back out in the woods. I know you're in your 50s now, and this happened to you when you were 13. If someone were to ask you, what do you think Sasquatch is, what would you say to them?
Well, if Sasquatch is the thing I saw, which I'm pretty sure it probably was, it's an animal. It's an animal, and I do believe that it is. It's funny. I hear people say. In fact, not too long ago, I heard someone bring this up. Well, they'll say something like, "How come we haven't found a big, a Sasquatch body? It's one that's just died in the woods." Well, how come we don't find dead bears everywhere? You don't hear people saying, "Oh, it's routine to find dead bears," because the ones that do die, the ecosystem takes care of itself. Other predator animals eat dead animals and stuff like that. Even the bones sometimes, or the bones get scattered. So I don't buy all that stuff. It's like we don't have. I know that the scientific community in general won't believe in this stuff until they have one. It's going to take someone either shooting one and killing it or capturing it or something like that before they're ever going to take this seriously. All I know is that what I saw was an animal, and it was definitely not a bear. It was definitely not. I mean, first off, size-wise alone, I don't even think that now, knowing what I do know now, that's the which those bears that they say are like the largest grizzlies. Is it the Kodiak bear or something like that? That get these massive size. It was big. It was bigger than what they can get. I mean, now that I think back to it, it was huge. The proportions were huge. I think it's an animal. I think it's possible that it's an animal that maybe, when you look like gorillas and chimpanzees and stuff. I mean, they've been able to teach I'm sorry, I'm saying it wrong. I think chimpanzees. Yeah. They've been able to teach them sign language. It's very possible that there's some other branch of primate that's not us, that's more intelligent or just a different animal. And I think it's an animal. That's my thought.
Yeah, I like your answer, and I hope you're right, because, no one really knows. But what an amazing account. And, it's something to where it'll stay with you the rest of your life. It has most of your life, and it's just something that'll never go away. But when people come forward, we can gather so much information, behavior and that sort of thing. I really enjoyed chatting with you, Darren. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Welcome. It was my pleasure as well. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about it.
Thanks again, Darren. And that's it for tonight, everyone. Remember, if you've had an encounter, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. If you get a chance, check out sasquatchchronicles.com. You can become a member and get additional shows. Until next time, everyone.